The year was 1884, and the wind that swept across the high plains carried more memory than mercy. It howled through the cottonwoods, bent the sagebrush flat, and whispered against the walls of a lonely ranch house that sat a mile from the nearest soul. Inside that house lived a man named Stephen Hale, 31 years old, strong as a bull and built like the barns he repaired with his own hands. He had a face cut from quiet stone, eyes the color of rain on iron, and a silence that had settled in him like dust that never left the floorboards. He hadn't always been this way. Once, his laughter could be heard clear across the pastures. But somewhere between losing his father to fever and watching the woman he loved ride away with another man, something in him had gone still. He spoke now only when needed, to his horses, to the weather, and sometimes to God when he forgot that God hadn't answered in years. His neighbors called him the Ghost Rancher, and though they meant in jest, Stephen had long accepted that title as truth. Each day began the same. Dawn cracked open the horizon, spilling cold light over the valley, and Stephen stepped into the yard with his coffee steaming in the brittle air. He'd mend a fence, fix a hinge, feed the horses. The rhythm kept him from thinking too much. The silence was his only companion, and it never asked anything of him. But one gray morning, the rhythm broke. The wind carried the creak of wagon wheels, and the weak cry of a mule struggling up the slope. Stephen set down his axe and watched as a weather-beaten wagon rolled to a stop near his gate. A woman climbed down, her dress frayed, her boots soaked in mud. She couldn't have been more than 27, young, yet already bearing the weary grace of someone who had known hunger too long. Behind her, a frail older woman descended slowly, gripping the wagon edge for balance. "Sir," the younger one said, her voice soft but steady, "we were told you might need help. We can cook, clean, work for a meal or a roof. Just until spring." Stephen studied them. The younger woman's hands chapped from cold, her eyes carrying both defiance and shame. The older woman coughing into a torn shawl that did little to hide the tremble in her bones. He could have turned them away. He almost did. But something, maybe mercy, maybe loneliness, moved in him. "There's an empty bunkhouse," he said finally. "It's cold, but the stove works. You can stay if you earn your keep." The younger woman nodded, relief flickering across her face like sunlight through clouds. "Thank you, sir. My name's Clara May. This is my mother, Mabel." Stephen only tipped his hat. "Stephen," he said. Nothing more. They settled in quietly, the two women like ghosts made of kindness and exhaustion. Clara cleaned the cabin first, sweeping months of silence from its corners. Mabel cooked with trembling hands, stirring beans and salt pork as if she were feeding an army. For the first time in years, Stephen came home to the smell of food and the sound of soft voices drifting from his kitchen. He didn't speak much, but he listened. He learned that Clara had lost her husband to fever during the winter drive, that her family's wagon had been robbed near Abilene, and that she'd been turned away by every ranch along the valley trail. He noticed how she carried her mother's weight without complaint, how she smiled even when her hands bled from washing. One night, he found her outside chopping wood, sleeves rolled to her elbows, breath visible in the lantern glow. "You'll freeze," he said, the word strange in his mouth after so much quiet. She looked up, startled to hear him speak. "Someone has to keep the fire going." He stepped forward, took the axe from her gently. "That someone's me." Their eyes met for a brief moment, hers uncertain, his unreadable. Then he swung the axe, splitting the log clean in two. The sound echoed through the yard like the first crack in a long frozen heart. Days turned into weeks. The ranch changed without his noticing. The barn swept clean, the kitchen warm with bread, the sound of Mabel humming hymns that even the wind seemed to soften for. Stephen found himself leaving small gestures behind, an extra log by their door, a repaired lantern, a loaf of bread on the table. He said nothing about them, and they said nothing back, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't loneliness anymore, it was something gentler, waiting to be named. Still, the town talked. At the mercantile, men nudged one another when Stephen came in, saying, "Hale's keeping 2 strays on his land." Women whispered behind the fabric counter, pity and judgment blending like perfume and smoke. Stephen heard them, but he didn't answer. He bought what he needed, nodded once, and walked out. The old him might have cared. The new him only tightened his grip on the reins and rode home. Winter deepened. The nights grew cruel, and so did the loneliness that slipped beneath the doorframe. One evening, Mabel's cough worsened. Clara sat by her mother's bedside, eyes red, whispering prayers that hung in the air like frost. Stephen stood by the doorway, helpless, watching the flame of the lamp flicker against the tears on Clara's face. When the storm came that night, it trapped them all inside. The wind roared like an angry spirit. Snow piled against the windows. Mabel drifted in and out of fevered dreams, muttering the names of people long gone. Stephen stayed awake through the night, feeding the fire, boiling water, holding the lantern near the bed, while Clara dabbed her mother's brow with trembling hands. At one point, Clara's head bowed. "I don't think she'll make it." Stephen didn't speak. He just took the damp cloth from her hand and dipped it back into the basin, his movements quiet, reverent. The storm beat on, but inside that cabin, there was only the soft sound of care, the unspoken mercy of two souls who had found each other through need. When dawn came, Mabel was breathing easier. Clara woke to see Stephen slumped in a chair by the fire, asleep, the lantern still burning beside him. His rough hands rested on his knees, the heat from the hearth painting his face in soft gold. For the first time, she saw him not as the hard man who owned the ranch, but as the man who stayed up all night for a woman he barely knew. Something inside her shifted, not love yet, but the quiet beginning of it. By afternoon, the storm had passed. The world outside lay buried in white, the fences and fields swallowed by silence. Stephen rose, stiff from the chair, and went to fetch water from the frozen creek. Clara watched him through the frosted window, his shoulders broad beneath his coat, his breath clouding the air. He moved like a man who carried both weariness and purpose, the kind of strength that had nothing to do with muscle. She opened the door a crack as he returned, her mother sleeping soundly for the first time in days. He stopped at the porch, water bucket in hand, and looked up. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind had gone quiet, as if listening. Stephen gave a small nod, not a command, not a farewell, just a simple, wordless promise. "You belong here now." Clara held his gaze, her lips parting as if to thank him, but no sound came. Words would have been too fragile for what they both understood. Inside, the firelight danced along the cabin walls. The air smelled of pine smoke and survival. And somewhere in the hush between their breaths, the silence that had ruled Stephen's life began to thaw, not with a declaration, but with the warmth of a single look that said everything words never could. Spring came slow that year, melting the snow inch by inch, the way sorrow thaws into hope. The land around Stephen Hale's ranch breathed again, and so did he, though he hardly noticed the change. The long months of winter had drawn something fragile between him and Clara May, something quiet but alive. He saw it in the way she lingered by the window when he rode out each morning, in the way she hummed when setting his plate down, in the softness that entered her voice whenever she said his name. Still, neither of them spoke of what was happening. The silence between them had become sacred ground, and neither dared to disturb it. Clara's mother, Mabel, was growing weaker with each week. The color had returned to her cheeks after the fever, but her strength had not. She spent her days on the porch, wrapped in blankets, whispering prayers and watching the meadow bloom. Clara cooked and washed, mended and cared, her movements graceful, her face lit with quiet endurance. Stephen began finding excuses to stay near the house. He'd sharpen tools slower than usual, mend fences that didn't need mending, just to hear the faint rhythm of Clara's steps across the floorboards. He wasn't a man who'd ever known how to say the things that swelled inside him, so he showed them in the only way he knew, by fixing what was broken. He rebuilt Mabel's chair when it split at the leg, patched the leaky roof, repaired the stove door that jammed each morning. One evening, as the sky burned gold and lilac, Clara came to the porch where he was repairing a harness. "I know you don't like fuss," she said softly, "but thank you for all you do." He didn't look up. "Don't thank me, ma'am. You earn your keep." She smiled faintly, brushing her skirt. "Maybe. But no one else ever looked at me like I was worth that much." He paused mid-motion, the leather strap trembling slightly in his hand. "You are," he said. so low she almost didn't hear. She stood there a moment longer, watching the horizon, her throat tight with something that frightened and comforted her all at once. The weeks unfolded like pages turning slow. The town began to notice. When Stephen brought Clara and Mabel into town for supplies, whispers followed them through the general store like wind through dry grass. "That's the Hale woman now," someone said, cooking her way into his bed. Clara lowered her gaze, her face hot with shame. But Stephen only squared his shoulders and paid for the flour. As they left, he handed her the bundle without a word, his eyes steady. That night, she thanked him for not answering the gossip. "I don't know them words," he said. "Only you and your mother know what's true." Their bond deepened in silence. Yet with every act of kindness came an ache of uncertainty. Clara began waking at night, heart heavy with fear. Fear of wanting too much, of believing she belonged somewhere again. She'd once been a wife. She'd once known love. But she also knew loss, how it stripped a woman bare until she had nothing left but duty. When Mabel's breathing grew shallow that summer, Clara sat by her bedside, tears falling silently. Stephen lingered in the doorway, hat in hand. When the end came, it was gentle, a sigh, a hand slipping loose from Clara's grasp. The old woman was gone before dawn. Stephen built the coffin himself. No one from town came to help, but he didn't mind. He dug the grave beneath the elm behind the house. Clara watched from the porch, her face white, her hands trembling as she clutched a faded shawl. When it was done, Stephen stood beside her, covered in earth, eyes downcast. "She deserved more," Clara whispered. "She had you," he replied simply. "That's more than most." She broke then, sobbing into his chest, and he let her, his calloused hands resting gently on her back, his jaw trembling though no sound came. It was the first time they'd touched beyond duty, and in that embrace something wordless passed between them, grief folding into gratitude, loneliness into belonging. The next weeks passed in a hush. The house felt emptier without Mabel's soft voice, but it also felt alive in a new way. Clara cooked still, but she laughed now, sometimes shyly, sometimes bright. She moved through the rooms like light filling a once dark place. Stephen, in turn, began to speak more. Not much, but enough for her to know his heart was learning how. One morning, she rose early to find him outside, mending the corral fence. The sun had barely broken the hills. "You don't have to fix everything," she said, stepping closer. He smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but I've lived with too much broken." Their eyes met, and for the first time, she reached out, brushing dust from his sleeve. The gesture was small, but it held everything neither dared to say. Yet peace never lasts long under a wide western sky. The next week, when Clara went into town alone for flour and lamp oil, a merchant made a crude remark loud enough for everyone to hear. "How much you charge for your cooking, miss? Bet Hale pays more than he lets on." Laughter followed. She froze, humiliation stinging like windburn. She fled the store with tears blurring the dusty street. That evening, Stephen noticed her silence. "Something happened?" Her voice cracked. "They think I'm ashamed to your name. Maybe I should go." He stood there, breathing slow, something deep and dangerous flickering in his eyes. "They don't know my name," he said. "Not what it means." The next morning, Stephen rode into town. He found the merchant outside, sweeping dust from his porch. The townsfolk stopped to watch as Stephen dismounted, his shadow falling long across the street. "You spoke about a woman who cooks at my place," he said calmly. "You'll take those words back." The merchant stammered, trying to laugh it off, but Stephen's stare silenced him. "She's my wife," Stephen said then, his voice cutting through the wind like a blade. The street went still. He hadn't planned the words. They rose from someplace truer than thought. "Been that way in my heart a long while. Now I'll make it right before heaven." He rode home without looking back. Clara was on the porch when he returned, her eyes wide with confusion. He took off his hat, stepped close. "I said something in town today. You can tell me if I was wrong." "What did you say?" she whispered. "That you're my wife." Her lips parted, a breath trembling between disbelief and wonder. "Stephen." He nodded once. "Don't want to hide anymore." That evening, under a sky bruised with stormlight, they walked together to the small, white chapel on the hill. The preacher, startled but willing, lit 2 candles. No rings, no dress, just the scent of dust and rain, and 2 people who had learned love the hard way. When the preacher spoke the blessing, Stephen's hand found hers. It fit as if it had waited a lifetime. As thunder rolled in the distance, he looked at her with quiet certainty. "Didn't mean to fall for you," he murmured. "Just happened while I was learning how to breathe again." She smiled through tears. "Then let's keep breathing together." When they stepped outside, rain began to fall, soft and cleansing. The world smelled of wet earth and beginnings. They rode home, side by side, neither speaking. The house glowed with firelight when they arrived, warm and golden against the storm. Stephen opened the door and paused, letting Clara enter first. She looked around, at the hearth, the table, the walls that had once known only silence. Now it all seemed to exhale alive again. He closed the door behind them. For the first time in years, the ranch was not a place of echoes, but of hearts still learning how to live. And somewhere beyond the window, under the rumble of rain and the cry of a faraway coyote, the plains whispered the truth that every soul must learn, that even the loneliest house will breathe again when love finally dares to stay.